Morning broke over the trenches like a pale whisper, a mist clinging to the mud with a quiet persistence. The German soldiers stirred in the damp earth, their boots sinking into soft, sticky soil that smelled faintly of iron and rain. Tiny rivulets traced uneven paths through the trenches, carrying with them the chill of the night's frost. From far across the fields, the muted thunder of British artillery rolled in waves, a distant heartbeat of war that never ceased. Every cough, every scrape of wood against earth echoed sharper in the low light. Men adjusted their collars and tightened their boots, their breath forming little clouds in the cool air, while the pale sun struggled to penetrate the fog, scattering silver threads across wet sandbags. The smell of damp canvas mixed with the earthy tang of mud, a constant reminder of the trench's suffocating intimacy. A rat scurried along a trench wall, pausing briefly before vanishing into a dark burrow, a silent witness to the quiet misery. Conversations were low, almost ritualistic murmurs, as if raising the volume might awaken the unseen horrors waiting beyond the fog. Amid the shivering and clatter, there was a strange rhythm, soldiers moving in careful patterns, fetching water, checking rifles, and sharing brief nods that spoke more than words could capture. The world outside seemed suspended, each moment stretched between the distant booms and the closer, more human noises of survival. And as the mist slowly lifted, revealing jagged earthworks and the endless horizon, a quiet tension lingered, threading through the men's movements, ready to unravel at the slightest crack of distant artillery. Letters from home offered a fleeting escape from the relentless reality of the trenches. Folded papers, smudged with fingerprints, carried familiar handwriting that seemed impossibly soft in contrast to the cold, mud-lined walls of the front. Soldiers read quietly, eyes tracing words from parents, lovers, or children, each sentence a lifeline to a world far removed from the constant drum of war. A few smiled faintly, a tug at the corners of lips that vanished almost instantly, replaced by the weight of the rifle at their side. The letters smelled faintly of ink and paper, carrying echoes of kitchens, gardens, and laughter, all of which seemed impossible amid the stench of damp wool and gunpowder. In these moments, men became more than soldiers. They were brothers, sons, fathers, lovers, human beings with memories and desires. The fragile connection to home made the trenches' mud and mist sharper in contrast, reminding them of what had been left behind and what might never return. Even as they folded the letters back into their pockets, the tenderness lingered, a quiet warmth in the cold, waiting to be carried forward into the day's endless routine. The enemy existed first as a shadow, a story passed along whispered lines and written words before ever being seen in flesh. German soldiers imagined British soldiers with broad, stern faces, clad in uniforms stiff and proud, voices carrying arrogance across the fields. Rumors flourished, painting the enemy as cunning, cruel, and unyielding, a faceless mass of discipline and intent. Some spoke of manners so precise they seemed unnatural, as if every movement were rehearsed. Others imagined hearts hardened by comfort and distance from real suffering. These images were fueled by caricatures in newspapers and tales from officers, designed to heighten vigilance and deepen loyalty, threading a subtle tension through daily routines. Yet within these soldiers' minds, curiosity persisted, a flicker of wonder about the reality behind the myths. Questions surfaced quietly. Were the British truly so different from themselves? Did they laugh when no one was watching, feel fear in ways similar to the men crouched in mud and mist? In the dim light of dawn, the trenches held the soldiers' anxieties and speculation like mist in the air, waiting to coalesce into reality. Observing from behind sandbags, hearing distant shouts and the occasional sharp echo of rifle fire, soldiers felt the pull of imagination against fact, a thin veil that separated rumor from truth. The enemy, so carefully constructed in mind and story, hovered at the edges of perception, both known and unknowable, frightening yet strangely human, a puzzle waiting to unfold as the war advanced, moment by tense moment. The first glimpses of British soldiers across no man's land arrived like shadows moving in a dream. Through the thin veil of morning mist, German eyes caught the flash of brass buttons and the movement of rifles as men adjusted their positions along the opposite trench line. Fear and fascination intertwined. Every step, every glance was a silent negotiation between dread and curiosity. The field between them seemed endless, scarred by shell craters and tangled barbed wire that twisted like metal thorns. Occasionally, a figure would pause, silhouetted against the gray horizon, and the Germans would hold their breath, wondering if a single misstep would ignite chaos. The wind carried faint sounds of voices, clipped orders, or the soft shuffle of boots, distant yet intimate, threading unease through each heartbeat. Soldiers squinted, measuring, calculating, imagining faces behind helmets, questioning what thoughts crossed the minds of men they had been taught to despise. There was a strange rhythm to the observation, a slow, deliberate scan, the occasional murmur, the restless adjustment of rifles. Some glanced at the ruined landscape, trying to imagine the lives that had once moved through these now barren fields. Every distant laugh, every whispered command held the weight of unknown intent. In this delicate balance between fear and fascination, the Germans felt the enormity of the war's human dimension, sensing that beyond the mud and wire, the enemy was not merely a target, but another presence shaped by uncertainty, habit, and a cautious will to survive. Amid the tension, small, quiet moments revealed glimpses of humanity across the trenches. A British soldier lit a cigarette, the tip glowing briefly like a tiny star against the gray expanse, inhaling slowly and exhaling into the cold air. Another hummed a tune, a soft melody that drifted faintly, almost imperceptible, carrying a strange comfort. Gestures, offhand scratches of the head, the careful straightening of a coat, the gentle adjustment of a rifle strap, hinted at ordinary routines, small acts of self-care that bridged the invisible gap between enemy and observer. In these fleeting instants, German soldiers paused, caught between suspicion and recognition, noticing that the men across the field were as human as themselves, bound by fatigue, habit, and the quiet struggle to endure. The harsh lines of ideology softened briefly, replaced by the awareness that courage and fear coexisted on both sides, that laughter and song could exist even amid destruction. These understated glimpses lingered, leaving impressions as delicate as mist on the morning wire, moments that would return to memory in the long, silent hours of trench life. Diaries offered windows into thoughts that otherwise remained unspoken, confessions of surprise, admiration, and measured contempt. One soldier wrote of a British officer whose careful attention to men's needs seemed incongruous with the image of a cold adversary, noting the way he moved among his troops with practiced calm, distributing rations and offering brief words of encouragement. Another described noticing the precision and care with which the enemy maintained their trenches, the neat rows of supplies, the meticulous repair of sandbags, a silent testament to discipline and pride. There were moments of admiration, tinged with unease, when German eyes observed bravery and ingenuity that rivaled their own. Yet the diaries did not shy away from contempt, noting arrogance, stubbornness, or the rigid adherence to orders that bordered on absurdity. Even in critique, there was recognition of shared experience, the shiver of dawn cold, the taste of mud and stale bread, the quiet desperation that threaded through all men on the front lines. These entries, written in small, precise hand on worn pages, captured a complex landscape of perception. The enemy was at once formidable and human, strange yet familiar. Through their words, the soldiers revealed the slow unraveling of myth, the tentative bridge between expectation and reality, and the quiet curiosity that persisted despite the constant drum of war.
By reading these reflections, the mind of the observer expanded, stretching across no man's land, sensing the delicate humanity that persisted even in the shadow of conflict, and preparing to see the enemy in light more nuanced than any rumor could provide. Folded letters, worn at the creases and smudged with mud-stained fingers, carried more than words. They carried the pulse of distant lives into the trenches. One soldier wrote of a fleeting friendship formed across no man's land, a quiet camaraderie born not of allegiance but of shared endurance. Names were exchanged on paper, sometimes with a cautious flourish, sometimes with shaky handwriting that betrayed both nerves and hope. Another recounted the nervous respect held for a British sniper whose precision was feared but admired, the way his discipline demanded acknowledgement even in hostility. Letters revealed fear as well, the tremor in words describing sudden artillery barrages, the whispered dread of patrols through tangled wire. Yet alongside fear there were moments of reflection, observations of ordinary routines that mirrored their own. Small acts of tidiness, the care taken in dressing wounds, the silent rituals of survival. These pages became intimate confessions, bridging the divide of enemy lines, reminding the reader that even in war, humans were capable of recognition, of noticing skill, bravery, and persistence beyond ideology. Each folded sheet, a lifeline to understanding, traced the contours of hearts that beat as anxiously under foreign helmets as they did beneath familiar ones, carrying empathy across distances measured not in miles but in shared circumstance. And as soldiers tucked the letters back into their pockets, they carried both warmth and weight, the knowledge that connection could exist even amid the fog of battle. State narratives proclaimed the enemy as monstrous, untamed, and wholly separate from the German soldiers' own humanity. Posters depicted rigid formations and caricatured faces, each image designed to cultivate obedience and sharpen loyalty. Yet in the mud, in the quiet pauses between shelling, the soldiers' thoughts diverged from the prescribed story. Observations contradicted slogans. Glimpses of courage, laughter, and care across no man's land clashed with the official account. The propaganda line dissolved in the face of lived experience, replaced with curiosity, tempered respect, and an understanding that war was carried by humans, not caricatures. Ideology met reality in silent reflection, where thought could wander beyond orders and the mind could quietly acknowledge the enemy as complex, flawed, and unexpectedly familiar. Moments of shared humanity threaded through the trenches like fragile light. A soldier recalled helping a wounded British man, pressing gauze to a bleeding arm while artillery groaned above them, the enemy's eyes wide with cautious trust. A British medic offered bread to a German youth shivering in damp clothes, and for a brief moment, both men were simply human, hangry, cold, anxious, alive. In the hush of night, voices met across the field in the soft cadence of singing or whispered conversation, cautious notes that reminded each side of music's universality, the shared pleasure in sound and rhythm. Small gestures, passing water, covering a face during rest, exchanging the rare cigarette, became profound statements against the backdrop of destruction, quiet rebellions of empathy. Diaries captured the awe that accompanied such encounters, the astonishment that an enemy could show kindness, the uneasy recognition that courage was mirrored on both sides. Soldiers noted the subtle rhythms of routine, mirrored in the precise movements of the other, realizing that the same fatigue, hunger, and longing governed their days. In these observations, humanity seeped through the cracks of ideology, painting a portrait of war that was not solely about fear or hatred, but about connection, fragility, and understanding. These glimpses lingered in memory, quiet yet persistent, shaping the way soldiers perceived each other and softening the rigid walls erected by rumor, and the endless machinery of conflict. Through such moments, empathy threaded its way into perception, offering a fragile yet luminous understanding that, even in war, men were never truly alone. The reels of engagement often arrived in whispers, carried along the trenches like fragile directives against a backdrop of mud and steel. German soldiers observed British tactics with a mix of caution and curiosity, noting how discipline shaped every move, every advance and retreat measured with precise intent. There was a method to the apparent chaos, an ethics of battle that emerged in the choice to spare certain positions or avoid unnecessary slaughter when possible. Orders were followed with strict adherence, yet the soldiers could sense the tension between command and conscience, the subtle indications that even the enemy wrestled with principles beyond mere survival. Some paused to study the opposing lines, noticing restraint in targeting or the careful evacuation of the wounded. In those moments, ethics were not abstract doctrines but visible behaviors, tangible in gestures, pauses, and the rhythm of cautious, deliberate action. Every cautious approach, every measured barrage, became a quiet testament to the discipline that governed human life even amid destruction. The Germans, watching from their sodden trenches, sensed an underlying morality in the enemy's movements, a code shaped by both strategy and conscience, compelling reflection on the choices that defined a man in war. In the foggy light of dawn, these rules of engagement were more than instructions. They were windows into shared humanity across barbed wire and no man's land, revealing that even war adhered to its own fragile ethics. Amid the violence, acts of compassion emerged as fragile, luminous moments. A soldier might spare a wounded enemy crawling in the mud, offering water or a nod of recognition instead of a shot. Shared rituals arose in quiet corners, a cigarette passed across the trench, a brief exchange of bread, or a word spoken across the battlefield that carried acknowledgement rather than threat. These small and fleeting gestures seemed almost ceremonial, as if both sides understood the unspoken covenant of survival and respect. In these delicate instances, the enemy was not a target but a fellow human, and the act of mercy became a quiet assertion of morality, a reminder that even in the machinery of war, conscience persisted, threading brief moments of warmth through the cold, relentless rhythm of conflict.
Inner conflicts gnawed at the minds of many soldiers, quietly unraveling the certainty with which they had once marched into the trenches. In journals and whispered confessions, men described the unease that settled over them in moments of solitude, the awareness that killing, once justified by duty, now felt heavy, complex, and morally ambiguous. Some questioned the purpose of orders, the validity of campaigns, and the stories that had framed the enemy as wholly other. Others wrestled with the reflection that courage and fear were mirrored in both camps, that the same hearts beating under foreign helmets were as human, as vulnerable as their own. Soldiers contemplated the lives they touched, the destruction wrought, and the invisible lines of kinship that war could not sever entirely. Nights were punctuated by vivid memories of moments of mercy, glances of understanding across the field, and the small kindnesses that contradicted the brutal necessities of strategy. Guilt mingled with awe, frustration with admiration, creating a landscape of emotion far more nuanced than any propaganda or rhetoric could capture. Each decision to act, to pause, to spare or strike, became a meditation on morality, compelling reflection on the nature of right and wrong when survival and duty collided. In the quiet intervals between shelling and patrol, soldiers found themselves questioning the war, the enemy, and ultimately themselves, tracing the contours of conscience in the mud, mist, and measured silence of the trenches. And in this reflection, a subtle, persistent truth emerged. War was never simply a matter of orders and obedience, but of the enduring, fragile, and often painful moral choices that defined what it meant to remain human amidst the machinery of conflict. In the quiet corners of the trenches, diaries lay open, revealing the raw, unfiltered thoughts of soldiers. One German soldier wrote of a British corporal who had stoically carried a wounded comrade to safety, ignoring the whistle of incoming shells. The precision of the act, the calm determination in the face of danger, left an impression that lingered long after the words were read.
Another entry recounted a brief encounter during a lull in fighting, when a British soldier offered a small piece of bread to a shivering German youth, a gesture simple in action, but monumental in its humanity. These letters spoke of courage that transcended allegiance, of kindness offered across invisible borders drawn by fear and expectation. Soldiers described moments of hesitation when they saw their enemies not as faceless opponents, but as men enduring the same cold, the same hunger, the same relentless drum of artillery. Each diary page carried the heartbeat of empathy, a quiet recognition that bravery and compassion were not the property of any one side. As the men traced the inked words, they felt the strange intimacy of knowing their enemy, glimpsing a reflection of their own courage mirrored across no man's land. In these readings, the human dimension of war became tangible, and the rigid lines of ideology softened, revealing that acts of valor and grace could exist, even in the most inhospitable spaces. Trench life was a theater of shared endurance, where the constant cold gnawed at bones, and the hunger pressed heavily against stomachs already weakened by weeks of rationed food. Soldiers recounted the struggle to stay awake through nights filled with shivering, the endless damp seeping into every layer of clothing. Fear was a quiet companion, lurking behind every sudden noise, every shadow that fell oddly across the mud-streaked walls of the trench. Yet in these conditions, small stories of solidarity emerged. A comrade pressing a coat tighter around a trembling friend, the sharing of a warm sip of water, a whispered joke to stave off despair. These moments, fleeting and fragile, became threads that wove the soldiers together, creating bonds stronger than mere survival could dictate. Even in observing the enemy, there were glimpses of parallel struggles, men hunched against the cold, hands reddened by frost, voices muted in exhaustion. In the midst of deprivation and danger, shared human experience became a quiet sanctuary, a reminder that suffering, endurance, and small comforts were universal, touching all who stood along the scarred fields of battle. Silent respect lingered in the air like mist over the cratered landscape, subtle yet profound, a quiet acknowledgement of shared hardship. Soldiers recognized the bravery in every cautious movement across no man's land, the meticulous care in tending wounds, the disciplined precision in advancing under fire. It was a respect not of alliance, but of understanding, the recognition that each man, regardless of uniform, navigated fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion with comparable courage. In letters and diaries, men reflected on the paradox of admiration entwined with enmity. The same hands that might wield rifles were also capable of gentle gestures, a soft word, a shared ration, acts that transcended the boundaries of conflict. Observing British soldiers taking care to cover fallen comrades, adjusting helmets or maintaining trenches with quiet diligence, the Germans found a mirror of their own humanity, a validation of the integrity with which they themselves endured hardship. These silent acknowledgments were compounded in rare encounters, brief, wordless moments when eyes met across the fields, and in that gaze, each soldier sensed the complex humanity of the other. Respect became a language of its own, one unspoken but deeply felt, bridging the expanse of no man's land without ever needing articulation. Through this quiet contemplation, the soldiers grasped that war, while destructive and relentless, also revealed the resilience, empathy, and moral depth that persisted in men even when all else was stripped away. And as shells fell and the trenches shivered, the awareness of mutual respect lingered like a gentle echo, a reminder that amidst the roar of conflict, human understanding could survive, quietly enduring alongside courage and fear. After the guns fell silent and the mud-streaked fields lay empty, returning soldiers carried with them memories that were heavier than any pack. Letters, diaries, and fleeting moments of recognition resurfaced as they walked through streets far from the trenches, where normal life persisted, unaware of the past year's horrors. Thoughts of British soldiers lingered quietly, no longer framed by fear or ideology, but recollection of courage, discipline, and surprising kindness.
One soldier recalled the careful evacuation of a wounded comrade, the way a hand had been extended without question, without expectation, and he felt a strange, lingering gratitude. Another remembered the small gestures of warmth, a shared sip of water, a word of encouragement, a glance that acknowledged shared vulnerability. These reflections were neither boastful nor sorrowful, but calm, layered with the complexity of human experience. The awareness of shared humanity threaded through every memory, connecting acts of valor to acts of compassion, fear to fortitude, and self-preservation to ethical reflection. Soldiers felt the subtle, enduring presence of lessons learned under fire, the quiet understanding that life, even amidst destruction, held moments of grace, clarity, and insight. In this reflective stillness, the past did not oppress, it illuminated. They carried forward the knowledge that courage and fear, moral choice and empathy were inseparable companions in the human experience. And as they stepped into the ordinary world once more, the resonance of these lessons remained, calm yet persistent, a gentle reminder that even in the chaos of war, the human heart retains its capacity for understanding, for reflection, and for quiet, enduring connection.